meeting? Hello, hello? Yes. Okay, let's start. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm very happy to have the honor to welcome you here in Munich and online. Sorry? There in Munich online and here in Berlin in person. Yeah. It's the center of the world is in Munich. You didn't notice yet. Okay, in the name of MSF, Doctors of the World, Doctors of... Oh, I'm sorry, I reset a little bit. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, welcome in Berlin to this year's Congress. And I have the honor to welcome you in the name of the organizers, MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, MDM, Médecins du Monde, and the German Red Cross, together with their partners Oxfam and Humanity and Inclusion this year. We are very happy that so many found the way here to Berlin. We are also very happy to have people online. And so we hope for very lively debates, discussions, and exchange, as every year since now almost 27 years. This has a long tradition. Let me start this introduction with some practical consideration. As you see, the sessions in this room, but also in the Edison room, will be transmitted online and also recorded. You can use our hashtag HCBerlin to communicate in social media and promote the Congress. In the lobby, at the entrance you saw by entering the lobby of the Urania, you have seen the Humanitarian Forum with booths from humanitarian actors here in Germany. You will have time to visit them and exchange during the pauses. We also have an awareness team available to you on site every time, anytime. You will find them in the front of the room Austin, here in the floor beside us, for any problem, personal problem you could have. We'll provide coffee and snacks during the breaks, as well as a lunch here in the Urania, so don't run away during the lunchtime. And for any other questions around the Congress, please contact the Congress team at the registration on the downstairs. They are there for you. Our subject this year is named Critical Choices, Triaging Humanitarian Priorities. What a sinister title. Sinister because we don't mean only making critical choices because of the number or the intensity of the humanitarian crisis shaking this world. Even if we see all and feel that wars, natural disasters, structural poverty still and never stops to command our humanitarian agenda. The sheer accumulation of those crises force us to make critical, morally and humanly impossible choices. But more and more, we also see major political and societal change that affect the way humanitarian practice and principles are implemented. We see that the humanitarian space is shrinking dramatically and very quickly, forcing us to bitter decisions on priorities. Even democratic principles are being questioned and challenged, noticeably in the world, in the parts of the world considering themselves as the founders and the protectors of democracy. Some use the uncertainty in times of economic weakness and political fragility to fuel doubts and division, hoping to gain influence. The discourse becomes rough and simplistic, and with him the proposed solutions. Extremist movements provoke the established institutions, and these tend to adopt the same discourse in pretending to combat it. What we observe is an accelerated deterioration of the climate around the reasons why we think humanitarian and development aid are justified. More and more, governments traditionally supporting humanitarian efforts reduce radically their contribution out of budget considerations, but also, and this is more alarming, out of political calculation. There is a real recentering towards self-interest instead of genuine humanitarian considerations. This has dramatic consequences and affects directly millions of people in the very short term. As a bitter actual example, the German government decided to diminish its humanitarian budget for 2025 down to 50%. 50% in 1 year. How many projects will have to close? How many people will vainly wait for clean water, food, medical care? How will we decide that what continues and what not? What is this for a political sign in a doubting society? Bombing civilian areas is the terrible daily reality in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and sadly in many other places, killing civilians and more also humanitarian workers, sometimes deliberately. Will we have to decide to leave conflict areas because we are targeted? Depending on who is bombing, our governments adopt different standards to condemn and sanction. This endangers humanitarian action in the field massively. Many questions will be discussed in the coming days. Where do we exercise self-criticism and propose changes in our own humanitarian systems? And where do we resist and believe in our strength as legitimate counterpower? Exceptional personalities accepted our invitation to testify, share their experiences, and reflect on possible ways. This will hopefully inspire us to refuse resignation and keep the fire alive that makes humanitarian work so crucial. Go and listen to the sessions, participate actively to the discussions, meet your peers in the corridors during the coffee breaks. In other words, enjoy the Humanitarian Congress Berlin 2024. And let's start our rich program with the first keynote and discussion, chaired by Isabelle Arradon, Director of Research at the International Crisis Group. She will present herself and her panelists. Isabelle, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased and honored to be here with you today to start with this very important introduction with two outstanding keynote speakers. As was said, my name is Isabelle Arradon, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the conversations. I come from the political side, International Crisis Group. We spend a lot of time analyzing violent conflicts today, and as you know, there is no shortage of that. I lead on the early warning side, and we are, of course, very sad to see the devastating violent conflicts in various parts of the world. I'm thinking about Myanmar, Sudan, Somalia, Haiti, Ukraine, and of course the Middle East. The situation in Gaza over the past year has been absolutely terrible. When I was seeing the escalating violence between Hezbollah and Israel, and at Crisis Group we keep watching these situations very carefully. We advocate for ways to mitigate and prevent the violence. This session today is going live, and I would like to encourage participants to comment on X using the hashtag HCBerlin. So don't hesitate to share your thoughts, your comments as we discuss today. I would like also to mention that we have accessibility features for those who are not as fluent in English via the online channels. There is live translation into French and Spanish that the organizers are providing, so that's really great. I also understand there is another room somewhere where some participants are also watching the event. Later on, I will also provide them an opportunity to ask questions. So if they are really keen to ask questions to our keynote speakers, they can always come down here to this room and ask their questions. First of all, let me take a bit of time to introduce our two distinguished keynote speakers. We have online Heba Ali, who is joining us from New York. Hello, Heba. Heba, I'm sure many of you already know her. She used to be the CEO of the very well-known source of journalism about humanitarian crisis around the world called The New Humanitarian. Heba is a journalist by training, and she has spent a decade reporting from conflict zones in the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia. And she is now the coordinator of the UN Charter Reform Coalition, which mobilizes member states to update the UN Charter so that it can better address today's crisis. So thank you again, Heba, for being with us. We also have in person today with us Nimo Hassan, coming straight from Hargeisa in Somaliland, so a very warm welcome to you. Nima has over 15 years of experience in this field. She has been working for the Somali NGO consortium named Nimo, and she is also the newly elected chair of ICVA, who is an important forum for all of you to connect on the global stage. She has also had various roles with the Interagency Standing Committee. And Nimo has a background also specifically on the issue of education. She also attended university in Manchester for the personal element. I had a bit of a peek about their keynote speeches, and I'm sure it will trigger lots of stimulating thoughts for you. So we'll listen first to Heba, then it will be over to Nimo. We'll have a bit of a conversation, and then we'll hear from you if you have comments or questions directly to our speakers. Thank you. But first, over to Heba. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Sorry not to be with you in person today. We are witnessing a generational crime in Gaza, as a former colleague of mine at the New Humanitarian put it. And I think it raises existential questions for the international humanitarian system, which of course has felt impotent watching this unfold. And I would say humanitarian crises have always been political, but in recent years, in particular in Ukraine and in Gaza, the politics are really in the driver's seat, and humanitarians have been desperately trying to figure out how they position themselves accordingly. I think the answer to that question also answers a much bigger question about the future of humanitarianism in this world of shifting geopolitics, increased needs, shrinking funding, and many more constraints on those who are trying to help. So as Isabelle mentioned, I used to run the New Humanitarian, and almost every story we published chronicled unmet need. You hear cries for help from people in Northwest Syria, in Somalia, in Bangladesh, and each of these cries is heart-wrenching and deserves sympathy and help, but there are so many of them, and it's clear that all of these needs won't be met and can't be met. The overall funding to respond to humanitarian crises, as you know, has increased steadily in recent years, and yet organizations like the World Food Programme are having to make food ration cuts in many countries. And as humanitarian funding has nearly tripled since 2016, and that's the blocks in blue that you can see, so too has the level of unmet need in yellow. So every year, more than 40% of those who need help are not getting it. And last year that increased to more than 60%. So we're talking about a situation in which humanitarian aid is reaching well under half of those who need it, and that trend will continue. There will never be enough money to meet the rising needs, particularly, as was mentioned, due to the cuts we're starting to see in humanitarian funding, and in light of the trends we're seeing of climate change and a return of big power politics that will drive a continued rise in humanitarian need in the years to come. So what do you do when you can't help everyone? And you'll hear from Hugo Slim at the closing. And sorry, here you can see in this slide the cap that we're starting to see in humanitarian funding, even at organizations like the ICRC, which had its budget quadruple in recent decades. You'll hear from Hugo Slim at the closing, and he's much more schooled than I am in the concept of triage. But within the framing of triage, I think the answer to the question of what do you do when you can't help everyone has to be a back to basics approach, where you focus on those who are most in need. And that means no more education cannot wait, no more protracted crises, but really going back to the original mandates of the ICRC, of MSF, of intervening in the early days of the most difficult emergencies. But I would challenge us to ask, is the concept of triage the right question to apply? Or is there a way of avoiding the need to triage? And let me suggest a few other ways of thinking about this. First, and most obviously, localization. Localization is talked about ad nauseum in the sector, of course, but mostly through the lens of it being the right thing to do to meet the very legitimate demands of communities around the world who want to drive their own responses. Localization hasn't been discussed so much through the lens of being the only option, given the reality of little money and lots of operational constraints on international actors, including host governments who are demanding more control over aid responses, but also including an increasing number of crises that demand aid workers' attention back home, as we saw during COVID. And as one aid worker told me, the international community is used to parachuting into a single event. There is no parachute big enough for all of these crises. So to my mind, localization can be a way out of the terrible dilemmas that you face when you have to triage. And instead of choosing who to help, you can cover more ground if you focus on enabling a response by others. So I've put up here the World's Central Kitchen model because I think it's very interesting. It's a team of about 500 people, so much smaller than most international NGOs. And when a crisis hits, they go into a community and help that community help itself by identifying chefs and kitchens in the area and helping them get back on their feet in order to provide food for the community. So they tap into the existing capacity rather than having to use their own limited capacity. And I think everyone understands that at a basic level, and that in principle, humanitarian aid would cover more ground if communities could lead their own responses. So where's the problem? I think the real blockage to localization isn't so much the lack of political will, because I think there are more and more NGOs that are very genuinely trying to head in that direction. But rather, there are operational challenges. I think it requires a whole reorganization of the way INGOs work, and we haven't necessarily gotten our heads around that yet. And I think there's an obstacle in the trade-offs that arise. And by that, I mean the transition from doing to enabling others to do will necessarily leave a gap. And that, in my view, is a terrible but necessary trade-off. So in the short term, some needs that were being met by international NGOs will not be met while the transition to locally led response takes place. But in the long term, organizing an INGO around being able to enable the response of local communities, I think will save many more lives. So that's one way forward in an era of huge needs competing for limited resources. It doesn't solve your immediate problem of, how do we respond to all of these crises tomorrow? But in the long term, it creates an architecture that is much more set up for success. Another way forward is what Damien Lilly has described as moving from a humanitarian response to a crisis response. So what if humanitarians stopped thinking about humanitarian responses or even humanitarian development responses? We don't hear the word nexus used so much anymore, but and instead thought more broadly about what is the appropriate crisis response in any given setting. So in this model, in any given crisis, you as humanitarians, and then together with the development folks, the peace building folks, and led by the local communities, as a group determine what is it that this group of people most needs. And this model recognizes that what people most need in a humanitarian crisis may not be humanitarian aid. So during COVID, people needed social safety nets. Amid the Pakistan floods, the best crisis response may have been advocating for debt relief. In Congo, it could be asylum in Europe. And in Gaza, it's very much a vote at the Security Council. So as is often said, rather than being supply driven and insisting that as humanitarians, you deliver humanitarian aid, what if the role of a humanitarian becomes to advocate for the solution that this humanitarian crisis needs, whatever that may be? And my take is that in an age where there are not nearly enough resources to be able to respond to all the crises, instead of constantly playing catch up or whack-a-mole, and inevitably having to make tough triage choices, humanitarians could turn to tools other than humanitarian aid. Because with a smaller amount of money, you may well have more impact through advocacy about the larger problem than by saving half of those who need help, only in order for them to find themselves back in crisis the next day. So the framing of triage really suggests we don't have enough food and shelter for all those who need it. How should we choose who to save? You would get a very different answer if you asked, with the resources we have, what is the most impactful way to help those in need? Now, I take Damien's argument a step further. And my sense is that those who care about reducing suffering in the world today need to be thinking about how decisions are made at a global governance level, because that is what has real implications for those on the tail end of humanitarianism. So think of all the crises you're responding to: COVID, climate change, the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. What connects all of those crises? And when I was leaving the New Humanitarian and deciding what to do next, I thought long and hard about this. And the answer I came to was that the red thread was inequitable global governance. The inequitable distribution of power between countries and the unfair way in which decisions are made internationally is what leads to vaccines reaching some countries but not others. It's what leads to countries that least contributed to climate change paying the highest price. It's what leads to the inability or unwillingness to stop the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. So that's why I personally decided to turn my attention to global governance reform, and not just making multilateralism more effective, as is often the phrase, but making multilateralism work for the global majority and for those most in need. And there's an analogy that has always come to mind for me. If you are on a boat and it's taking water and you find a hole, you plug the hole. And then you find another hole, you try to plug that hole too. And then you realize that the whole boat is full of holes, and at some point you have to build a new boat. So when you get to the point where you can't keep up downstream, you have to look upstream. And with a limited pot of money, does it make more sense to spend that limited money helping a fraction of those who need it, or addressing the root cause of the problem? So for inspiration, here are a couple of projects that I'm currently working on. On the right, you'll see a QR code that takes you to the website of the Coalition for the UN We Need, which mobilizes civil society in strengthening and reforming the UN. And on the left is a newly launched effort, the UN Charter Reform Coalition, that is mobilizing member states to actually rewrite the UN Charter. So here we're talking about Security Council reform, among many other changes, to bring our global governance beyond the world of 1945. And many others are working on things like avoiding tax evasion or debt relief or fairer trade policies or the reform of the international financial architecture so that governments that are hit by crises have the resources they need to address them. Now, people will naturally argue that's not the role of a humanitarian. Humanitarians are not meant to address root causes of crises. But if you were to start from a blank slate today and ask, what is the best way of helping people in need? Surely the answer would not be handing out mattresses and hygiene kits to half of those who need it. So I guess what I'm arguing is it's time to redefine what a humanitarian is. It's not someone who delivers food and water, but someone who helps people affected by a humanitarian crisis. And that help can come in many forms. It's clear, as we have seen, that the people of Gaza need a ceasefire more than they need bags of rice and tarpaulin. And in many of these crises, what's most important is making the case with your own parliaments about how their policies impact others. Again, you might say these are not humanitarian activities, this is political. And I would answer today, being a true humanitarian in the broader sense of the term, as I've defined it, requires you to be political. In an age when, I keep coming back to this, more than half the needs are not being met, is humanitarian aid still the most effective tool to respond to crises? So if the mission of a humanitarian is to alleviate suffering, my humble offering to you is that the best way to do so in this current context is not providing toilets and tents, but pushing for more fundamental changes to the international architecture and to the geopolitics that drive countries to be in need in the first place. And we saw many aid agencies starting to do this in the case of Gaza. So again, to close, we are in a context in which the sector is being pushed to localize, cash is strapped, and the operating model of parachuting into a crisis is becoming more and more difficult. And in that context, moving away from operational delivery and towards more of an advocacy position may well be the future of many international NGOs anyway, whether you like it or not. That is an uncomfortable space to inhabit. And I think it does, as I said earlier, come with terrible compromises. You stop delivering humanitarian aid today and start focusing on transforming the system that leads to crises, and people will die. But people are already dying. There is no perfect option here. So which is the least bad option, especially when you take the long view? If humanitarianism is a means and not an end in itself, and if the end is reducing suffering, then I suggest we need a reimagination of humanitarianism from the delivery of aid to the protection of humanity. And that, among other things, means necessarily being more political. If some of this feels like it's going too far, that slide up there is to remind you that all change has always been met by resistance initially. And remember that the shifts that I'm describing here are intended to ensure that you can continue to meet your mission of alleviating suffering in the future. You are already having to triage. That's only going to get worse. In 20 years, we may well be living in a world in which crises are everywhere. International aid workers are not allowed into crisis zones. There's no money to respond, and communities are fending for themselves. So what can you do today to ensure that you are preparing for that world? I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heba, for these thought-provoking remarks, and I'm sure that will lead to many questions later on to try indeed to think through ways to ensure your broader community is fit for purpose, I guess. But before that, let's hear from Nimo about her own take on the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I actually wanted to thank Heba for her insights, which are truly inspiring, both thought-provoking and forward-looking. So rather than reiterating the many complex issues Heba has eloquently highlighted, or the potential models she's proposed, I believe it's imperative that we, as participants in this Congress and beyond, reflect deeply how we, humanitarians, can reshape and redefine the system. I think clearly we all agree that something has to give, and the way the system is currently moving is not the ideal to respond to the geopolitical context we live in and the crisis that we are trying to address. So we must position ourselves better, ensure that affected communities remain at the very heart of our response. And I will keep on repeating that. Affected communities, people who are in need, people in crisis, need to be in the center when and if we're redefining the way we respond. So for those enduring this crisis, it's not an abstract problem, it's a matter of life and death. Today, we gather in a world grappling with humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale, many reaching catastrophic proportions. These challenges are complex, involve both natural disasters and man-made conflict. While I won't rehearse the details, we all know too well, the consequences are tragically the same: starvation, immense suffering, and loss of life. All demand urgent humanitarian intervention. These challenges are compounded by global uncertainties, geopolitical tensions, rising xenophobia, an alarming trend towards building walls rather than bridges. Yet amidst these daunting obstacles, we find hope in the unwavering commitment of humanitarian workers on the front lines. These brave individuals risk their lives daily to deliver aid in some of the most dangerous and complex environments. Whether delivering assistance under fire in Gaza, navigating rebel-controlled territories in Syria, where I witnessed profound challenges this month, or serving communities facing ongoing threat of Al-Shabaab in Somalia. These heroes embody courage and dedication. Many have paid the ultimate price, sacrificing their lives to serve those in need. Unfortunately, despite all of these efforts, and the very reason why we're having this conversation today, is that many lives saved today might find themselves in a similar peril tomorrow. Humanitarian system often provides short-term solutions, a band-aid, rather than addressing the root cause of these crises. And as Heba presented, are these the jobs of us? Is it the humanitarians who should be doing these issues? And I think those are the questions that we need to confront and highlight the critical choices that we must make to ensure our actions are effective, equitable, and sustainable. Easier said than done with all the issues that we are facing. I've emphasized our effort must prioritize the most vulnerable, those directly affected by crisis. However, to truly meet the demands of today's rapidly changing world, we must also examine this broader question and ask ourselves what we need to be doing. So maybe it's not the needs that we need to triage, who gets saved, but rather the system that we are using to address this very diverse and complex humanitarian crisis. And one of the models that Heba put forward is looking at the crisis itself. And in my view, what truly needs to be triaged are not just the recipients of aid, of when resources are limited, but the root causes that lead to crisis in the first place. So this is what the model that Heba provided about putting localization at the forefront, as they are the ones in the communities, understand the context, and will stay when others are not able to access the communities in need. So again, I think when it comes to the funding gaps that we're all looking at, this could be the solution to address those things. So it is challenging. Funding gaps are really challenging, but they can also offer a crucial opportunity for us to transform humanitarian aid. Instead of seeing the funding gap as a barrier, we can use the constraints to drive innovation, sharpen our focus, and truly on what truly matters, and again, addressing the plight of the people in need, having them in the decision-making processes, giving them the opportunity, enabling them to drive their agenda. How do we do that? I think this is the conversation that we need to have. And I think we need to be true and frank to ourselves on what is possible to do as humanitarian and the different roles that we can take. One, as you've said, as Heba said, going back to the basics, providing those Band-Aid, save those lives, but also be in a position to advocate, be in a position to drive the agenda, and ensure that we are not in this cyclical circle. I have many notes that I'll come back to when we do have the conversation. So back to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Nimo, for these important elements. I mean, I must say, listening to both of you, I start wondering about what it means really to be a humanitarian aid worker today. And I hear questions about redefining what it can be. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about the implications of this redefinition that you're talking about, because if indeed the humanitarian aid worker goes more into the political space, what does it mean in terms of access? I'm thinking about Gaza, Lebanon, but also the Sahel, Myanmar, etc. In what ways would the new humanitarian aid worker be a political hostage of these situations? And also, what does it mean in terms of safety and security? You've touched on the fact that many workers have been attacked in recent months and years. I was wondering, Heba, if you could first respond to these questions, and maybe if you could pick on some of the points Nimo mentioned as well. Thank you.
Sure. I think this is the obvious concern in this kind of reimagination. What happens to the humanitarian principles? I think it's important to remember that there is a long history of non-neutral humanitarianism, and you might hear about this from Hugo as well tomorrow, because he's one of the kind of architects of this idea. But dating back to World War I, there were plenty of people who were seen as humanitarians, but who took sides. And that, triggers, again, a question around the humanitarian principles are a means to an end. They are not an end in themselves. And the objective of humanitarian principles is to improve access, as you said. But at the moment, actually, being neutral is not guaranteeing access in a majority of countries. In fact, right now, access is quite limited. So I'm not sure, first of all, that there's much to lose. But secondly, that counterintuitively, being more political may actually improve humanitarian access in certain crises, because it will increase legitimacy, trust, and reduce skepticism. So in a lot of the crises where local communities are very skeptical today of international aid workers, it is because I think that they don't see that those aid workers are actually invested in their cause. Now, I'm not saying everyone needs to adopt this approach, and there will always be a need for the impartial ICRCs of the world, but that's not the only viable model. And it may well be that being more political actually enhances the legitimacy of the humanitarian system, which at the moment is very much at stake. There's this rising concept of humanitarian resistance, which views justice for affected people as inseparable from humanitarian needs. And the argument goes that humanitarians should be leveraging the system for not only civilian protection, but also long-term justice and rights. And I think that can look like, recognizing the systemic injustices that drive a crisis, supporting local humanitarians that are committed to pursuing justice. It's not without risk, but it's not as though the current system is either. So that's what I would say about humanitarian principles. And I would just echo Nimo's point that, the reality is that the funding cuts are here. So whether you like it or not, there is going to need to be some kind of transformation. So why not use that as an opportunity to reimagine the system? Back to you.
Maybe I'll just quickly add on a couple of points. Specifically, I don't think one size fits all, and I don't think we should be idealistic in that sense, that we have a complexity and variety of crises. And I think having multiple tools as a humanitarian to address certain needs, I think that's what we should be looking at. If you look at protracted crisis, for example, in Somalia, we've been delivering the same response for the last 30 years, whether it's the outcomes of the climate crisis, having these cyclical droughts that are affecting communities, and you know, the fact that it's higher intensity, it's far more recurrent in frequency, and we're tracking water for 30 years. How long could you track water to address a systemic and climatic shock that's addressing people? It has to be something, and also it's expensive. It's not cheap. So finding various different solutions, finding a more accessible. Okay, so the Somalia problem sometimes is actually described as water problem. Sometimes we have too much of it, and sometimes we have none of it. But what is the solution to that? So looking at it from addressing a particular crisis for a particular solution. So I think having multiple models that you can apply when there is an onset crisis to where it's a long-term and protracted crisis. I think that's what I'm trying to get at here, is that we have to, some of it we're doing it. So there are ways of solutions, and looking the anticipatory action that that's happening, looking at the sort of digging wells and repairing wells. It happens. It really does happen. But does it happen systemically? Does it happen to address the largest scale? That should be the question. So it can't be one model fits all, but the redefining the system should enable us as humanitarians to use various tools to address needs that are specific. And I think the common denominator here would be putting the affected community at the center of the response, enabling a response rather than responding as international entities, empowering and ensuring that those on the ground who are there are given the tools to be able to respond and take ownership of that response. So empowering the locals a bit more, I think, needs to be, I think Heba put it as the most viable option. So just to go back and say, it's the models. We need to have various models. It cannot be one size fits all.
Thanks a lot. It makes sense indeed not to have the same models. But I just wanted to go back to the point Heba said earlier about being more political to improve access. What's your view on this in the Somali context? What would be the pros and cons of that?
I think the politics, I was talking to you earlier, saying I actually hate politics, but we cannot get away from politics, can we? So I think we need to I think in the sense of us advocating, so I think I see a couple of roles that we play, but we could play in a bigger role. One, we cannot get away from politics because it's politics and the failure of politics that actually give rise to many of the crises that we're talking about. We cannot operate completely siloed from that. We also need to be impartial. So you need to have your conflict analysis of the situation. You really need to understand the context of what you're supporting. So if politics are hindering your access to communities, then I think you play a different role as a humanitarian of saving lives, of cooperating and collaborating with those who have access. Not all of us need to access all the communities at all the times, but we need to work together as a collective, as a system, so that we are wearing different hats and that we are using different hats, and those who have access to enable them to deliver better. So it's not a blanket. The politics is not a blanket, but for us to say we cannot be political, it's also not feasible. It's not the reality on the ground. So we need to position ourselves in a way where we are helping rather than hindering, but also we're trying to hold account to those who do have powers and make those political decisions as well. So it's a delicate balance, I think, on how we do this, and I guess this will be the conversation that we're having across this Congress as well, yeah.
Can I just say, Isabelle, I think there's a distinction between impartiality and neutrality. So you can be impartial while not being neutral. In other words, you can see a right and wrong in the conflict while still helping everyone who's in need. Now, I think practically on the ground, there will, of course, be complexities around being more political. But I think we also undervalue the possibility that you have different positionalities that serve different groups in need. So if you take Yemen as an example, you could have Houthi-controlled areas accessing or providing need to those within their population, and then government-aligned entities providing need to those in need in their populations. And it's not always obviously so simple, but the idea that actually different groups that aren't neutral could provide aid to the communities within their areas of control is not such a crazy idea, and may well actually have more reach than trying to have one impartial actor who's reaching everyone. So I think, I'm not trying to be naive about this, but I think there are opportunities if we kind of unlock this idea that, oh no, humanitarian principles are the be all and end all, that open themselves up.
Thanks. I also had a follow-up question for you, Heba. You touched on the whole issue of reform of the global governance model. And as you know, it's not a new issue. I mean, it's been discussed for quite some time, UN Security Council reform, etc. And you seem to be quite hopeful about it. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a bit more why that is the case. What do you think are the opportunities? Because, you know, we could be discussing this topic in 20 years. What do you say?
Indeed. Well, I just came back. I'm actually in Geneva, but I did just come back from New York from the Summit of the Future, which was meant to be an opportunity to renew multilateralism. And many, I think, were disappointed by the outcome. But what became clear is that there is a real momentum around change. And people who have been in this space much longer than I have say that they feel Security Council reform is possible today in a way it hasn't been in decades. So I think we are hitting a tipping point in that regard. And why is that? Well, I think the state of the world and the very obvious total breakdown of the global security order over Ukraine and over Gaza has just made it now too obvious not to address. The African countries and as a bloc have been really pushing for change on this. But not only you have charismatic leaders like Mia Mottley in Barbados, who is really pushing for system change. Brazil now as the president of the G20 also. So a real kind of push from the global south that I'm not sure we've seen at this scale before. And a state of the world that is just so precarious that now something's got to give. So I think, yes, I am hopeful about Security Council reform. The summit didn't lead to an outcome on that, but it did map a roadmap and wrote, countries, all 193 countries by consensus, more or less, did agree that the historical injustice against Africa on the Security Council needed to be addressed, and committed to a process of reform. So that is a step forward, even if it's not yet across the finish line.
Thanks. I must say, in today's world, it does feel good to have a sense of hope about something, right? I will now turn to you all and see if there are some questions from the audience. And again, for those in the separate room, if you would like to ask questions, please come here. we will give you the opportunity. Anyone? I can see a question at the back, yes? If you could say from which organization you are as well, it'd be great.
Can you hear me? Yes, now. Mustafa Abdallah, I'm an anthropologist and I work for the Robert Koch Institute. I have a simple question actually, which is directed to Heba. My question is, all right. You are asking us to localize more, which is actually makes sense, and I totally agree with you. But how about in cases when the local cannot provide, like the case in Gaza? What happens then? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes, I see two at the front, one more at the back. So we'll take those at the back, and then we'll come back to you at the front.
Thank you, Ralf Sütter from the Berlin think tank Center for Humanitarian Action. I would have a question for Heba. Many things, always very inspiring and thought-provoking. I would have one question. Of course, it goes without saying that this is another crisis, which is a chance for change. Never waste the crisis for change, as we discussed several times before, last time with the COVID pandemic, about rebuilding better the system and the whole aid sector, etc. So we've seen little progress. My question would be on your other key point, the whole challenge of triage, even if we would have much faster progress on the localization side, on the other ways of change, as you rightly put it out, wouldn't solve the structural problem that we will have a boat, as you put it, with a lot of holes, and maybe we have then not a dozen but 10 holes in it, but we would still need to change the root causes in a way. My question would be, as I got you, there would be a financial tension in it, which makes sense to cease investing in humanitarian programming for the millions of people we can still reach and will reach in future, by rather using these funds and our efforts and the human resources, etc., in investing in political change. And could you maybe elaborate a bit what makes you hope that investing the, by nature anyhow, very limited resources, we talk about max $50 billion a year, that would lead to these power changes, the major international structural reforms you mentioned, like a new financial framework, like an economic system, like a power imbalance in the UN system. Why is that a financial issue? And why would you sacrifice the humanitarian efforts for the sake of investing in this somehow? And might we not end up in having neither nor in the end for various reasons? Thank you.
We'll take one more question before we turn back to the speakers.
Thank you. Alberto from MSF. My question or my reaction is to Heba, because somehow the way you present the taxes is like being something that you address and you solve with a single actor. But at the end, you have to engage with a variety of actors, many times in conflict among them. So I'm wondering how you can sacrifice neutrality in order to play politics and get access with a variety of actors.
Thank you. Heba, there were a few questions for you, so I suggest you respond first, and then Nimo may want to react afterwards.
Sure, very good questions. And Nimo will probably have a better, real life experience of the question from Mustafa about when locals can't provide, like in Gaza, because I think in Somalia there may often be corollaries. My first response, though, would be, are internationals able to provide in Gaza? I mean, it's not, again, we often look at one scenario in isolation, but when you compare it to the status quo, the picture changes a little bit. But putting that aside, I think the whole idea is that if we approached humanitarianism differently, we would have helped locals be in a better position to respond in a situation like today. And so the work would have been done in advance to enable those communities to be ready for a crisis. So I would argue that locals can't provide because we haven't given them an opportunity to, and I'm not even sure that that's a fair statement, that locals are not providing. I think there is a lot of community kind of mutual aid, and certainly in other crises that's what we've seen. And in Syria, which I know better having been there during the war, that was certainly the case, that we often heard, oh, locals can't provide, but in fact they were doing so in ways that were under the radar and not very recognized, but it was happening. Nonetheless, I maintain that I'm not suggesting there is no place for international actors, and I'm not suggesting there's no place for impartial international actors. I'm just saying that shouldn't be the only nor the dominant model as it is today. I don't know if Nimo wants to address that question in particular before I move on to the others.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I agree to somewhat with what you said, Heba. We've not put a lot to the test. We've not provided that support and build the systems internally to respond, but also communities are not passive. They do respond. They are the ones who are responding. If you take the example of the earthquake in Syria, it was the communities. Before help could arrive, it was actually the communities who were responding and supporting each other. The Gaza case is very much, I think, a different example, because you need peace, you need ceasefire for you to be able to respond, regardless of whether you're an internal, whether you're just part of the community, whether you're an institution, a local institution, or whether you're an international institution. You need peace and safe space for you to provide those assistance. But I think what's important here is the investment that is required by the international system to enable the locals to take that leadership, and how do we support them better, because they're the ones who are living in it. I think that's the point that I was trying to make as well. The system needs to enable the communities and the local systems to help itself and to be as they are the first responders. But like I said, for the Gaza case, everybody's under bombardment, and how do you support if you're not able to, if your own life is at risk? So I think we do. I also said that we need to have different tools to respond to different crises, right? And that's what is important when we're taking these examples. I think I'll leave it at that. Back to you, Heba.
Sure. Yeah, I think on the question from the Center for Humanitarian Action, I agree that the 50 billion from humanitarian is not going to be the game changer when it comes to changing the global architecture. But it's not just a financial question. It's also the fact that humanitarian aid upholds the status quo and makes it less necessary to change the system, because you make it such that things are almost okay, enough that it can be ignored. So if we go back to the case of Gaza, humanitarian aid in Gaza is more or less upholding the Israeli occupation, because it means that Israel does not have to take responsibility for its occupied territory, because UNRWA is doing its job for it. And so then it makes it easier to continue to not fix the problem, because you've kind of put the Band-Aid on it. And I know that's an unfair simplification, but I think the reality is that, and this is where I talk about trade-offs, that if you were to rip off the Band-Aid, and if there was no humanitarian aid in Gaza, as has been for the last 70 years at a huge cost, then the situation would be so dire that Israel would be under more pressure to actually end the occupation. And we've seen now how that has happened, right? That the gravity of the war has forced pressure on Israel that didn't exist before. So it's not, it's a gamble, I think, but again, I would say that the status quo is not giving a wonderful result either. And then Alberto, on your question, I mean, this was what I was trying to get at with the Yemen example, that yes, you have different actors and I'm not suggesting you play politics, but I'm suggesting that you, if, for example, you were to say, if you were to take a very political stance and be advocating with your national parliaments for a ceasefire, and that means that, for example, Israel wouldn't let you in, you have other vehicles that you could then be using. So for those, in my Yemen example, for those who are pro-Houthi, let's say, and not neutral, you can, through the Houthis, channel aid. For those who are anti-Houthi, you can channel aid through the government. That you can, in a way, play with that constellation of actors to your advantage. Of course, it's not that simple. And I think, and it will, inevitably, you will hit a wall. But again, let's not compare it to the current system as though the current system is working perfectly. I think the bigger challenge vis-a-vis having multiple actors is that the actions of one humanitarian agency then reflect on all humanitarian agencies. And so by some humanitarian agencies being political, you then actually crowd out the space for the impartial ICRCs and MSF. MSF has never been, MSF has always been engaged in advocacy, but for those who are acting on that impartiality and neutrality as their selling card, it makes their job more difficult. But I think we have to experiment a little bit with how we handle such situations, again, because the status quo is not tenable. I know these are unsatisfying answers, but I don't think there is a perfect answer in this context.
Thank you, Heba. I was just wondering if there were any reactions to the gamble that Heba has put on the table, and so I'm just turning to you all if there are comments, reactions, or maybe follow-up questions. I see one there, and then one at the top. Yes, so let's start, and one on this side.
Thank you both for those presentations. Heba, I am worried about that gamble.
Yourself as well?
Oh, sorry. My name is Abby Stoddard. I'm with Humanitarian Outcomes. I feel that by abdicating the operational roles and by abdicating presence and putting everything on the advocacy role, we are essentially saying that humanitarians should do what they are least effective at doing, which is advocacy. I don't know, we really don't have much leverage at all. And by not being present, by not providing anything, we have zero leverage. That's my worry.
We had someone a bit further down and then someone here.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm also a bit worried about, maybe I misunderstood what you mean exactly with gambling. Sorry, yeah, my name is Imad Kudmani. I'm studying Masters of Peace and Conflict Studies, and I used to be a humanitarian worker in Syria for many years. And again, to the word gambling, I'm not sure if I really understood it, because we're talking also about human lives here. Like, how can we really go into politicizing our actions on the ground, which honestly, I also think that this is, finally someone is speaking about this, because humanitarian actions cannot be separated from politics, as you said. So my question, and also that leads me also to think about, what is the real problem? Is it the charter and the policies and the international order, like when it comes to humanitarian laws and enabling, this law in general, or is it that we really need to reform? Like, we're talking about reforming, right? So what is really the problem? Because we see that we have all the laws that should put every state, obligate every state to allow and to give access to humanitarian aid, and we only see political bias, and we only see powerful states is dominating the decision eventually. So I'm not sure if it's really a global order issue, okay, when it comes to the policies and when it comes to UN and when it comes to all of these orders we have, or is it really on a higher political level that we really can't change eventually? I'm not sure if my question is clear, but
I think it's clear,
yeah.
and I'm sure Heba will be able to comment on that. And we had one question here as well from gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you. I'm Olivier Van Castel from Protect Humanitarians. I think a bit in line with the comment of AB, I wanted to say I'm 100%, 300% even on agreeing with you on localization and the need to enable local actors, local communities. However, I think on the debate around the principles, I think I would just like to put out there, maybe actually we need not a less principled or more politicized sector, but an even more principled sector, in which case maybe some of the key actors could refuse funding from countries who actually, at the same time that they claim to provide principled aid, also at the same time provide actually arms so that the need continues. I believe that is a more vocal stance. That's a clearer stance. I'm very much afraid that, and there are some examples that we can draw on that, because I think we are drawing here a line between the fact that principled actors would not necessarily be vocal or not necessarily be on the side of the needs of the civilians. And I think some of the most principled actors are actually also some of the most vocals. So I think, again, I would just like to put there as a test, maybe we should actually be refusing some of the large grants. I think that's something that's definitely achievable on our side, to basically question the fact that you cannot use or instrumentalize humanitarian aid actors as a fig leaf for not doing actually your job in the political and diplomatic area. Thank you.
Any reaction about to the questions and comments?
On Ahmed's question, I'm not sure I do understand what the higher political level is than the international order. I mean, for me, that is the highest political level. But on the points from Abby and Olivier, I think there's two different things here. The idea that humanitarians are not good at advocacy, then you need to retrain the workforce. And in the same way that, when industries changed and moved towards renewable energy or manufacturing jobs were replaced by AI, you had to retrain a workforce for a new set of skills. It could well be that humanitarians have to learn how to do advocacy better. And there are plenty of people that they can learn from. On the broader point, though, that by not being present, you don't have leverage, I think that's right. And my only offer would be to consider presence a little bit differently. So Danny Sriskandaraja, formerly head of OxfamGB, used to talk about wanting to see Oxfam as a kind of next generation social justice network that worked in solidarity with local groups. And if you think of it that way, you are part of a global network that is in solidarity with one another, and part of your network is on the ground in place X or Y. And so you have leverage or presence through that broader network that you are in solidarity with rather than in control of or the main player of. And I know that's conceptually still a little bit abstract, but if we move towards that kind of a model, then you could imagine that this kind of global network of social justice organizations, when one part of the network is hit by something, speaks out on behalf of that part of the network. And thus, you are present, but you're really seeing yourself as part of a bigger whole. And Olivier, I would absolutely agree. But I'm not sure those two things are in contradiction. So the idea that you should refuse funding is also political, in the sense of saying we're taking a stance. We think your government is has a problematic role in this conflict, and we don't want to be associated with that. So, I mean, either way, you can argue that you're being political if you take the money, if you don't take the money. But I would see that not taking the money as being a political statement, and so it is. Does it protect your perceived neutrality and impartiality? Yes, probably, and if you can do that. And I would encourage you to do that, all the better, and then move towards sources of funding that are more linked to this idea of a global social justice network rather than, American government paying American NGOs to further American interests by responding to a humanitarian crisis somewhere. Again, depending on which frame you use, you can see that as being more or less political. Sorry if that answer doesn't make much sense.
Thank you. I had some follow-up questions, but of course it's already 10:35 and we're finishing in a few minutes so that you can have a proper break before your next session starts at 11. So I will now turn to Nimo for some reactions to the comments and questions.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, and thank you for the questions as well. But I don't think this session was meant to give answers to all these problems. So if we can bring solutions and give you pre-designed solutions, I think that would have been ideal, but it's not. So I think it's great that we're provoking thoughts in thinking in the way you want to do things differently. I think on the individually, we need to be. Okay, so there are challenges to you as individual humanitarian workers, but also as part of and representing an institution, but also part of being the broader member of the humanitarian community. So I remember when I grew up in Manchester. I graduated, and then I took an internship job 4 months to Somaliland, and I'm still there 15 years later. And one of the things that I've decided, so I get a little bit stressed. You do this, you do this, you do this, but the problems are the same. You're having the same conversations again and again and again, maybe with different accents and different people. So earlier on, I sort of decided I'm in control of my little bit, and I can do my little bit. So when I was in education, it was about being a role model to young girls and ensuring that there's a better participation in the classroom and providing girl-friendly spaces. So there is, a space for girls to feel at school and be active and participate. So for me, I decided that is what I can do and that's what I can contribute. So that's my individual decision to the whole sector. Otherwise, you would get quite stressed with everything else that you have no control over. So basically, I'm giving that example because there are certain things that we can change as individuals, certain things that we could contribute into the wider system. But I think what's really important is the fact that we want to see a different system. We've been different humanitarian system which is closer to the people, with all of us playing different roles in how we do that. So as I started off with my presentation earlier, is putting the community at the heart of our response. Now, whichever way you want to address that, that is your prerogative, I think, as an individual and as the organization that you work with as well. This idea of refusing to take governments who are part and parcel of the problem, I think that's one very encouraging way of doing it. But in this current financial difficulties, I don't know how that would be feasible for the broader organizations as well. So and also because of this competition, I think there's a blur in the lines of where you take and how you position yourself. So this funding gaps should enable us to sort of position ourselves in the best way we can have a bigger impact and serve the communities better. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. we're coming to the end of the session, unfortunately. So I welcome everyone to speak with our speakers later on. Or I'm sure there are ways to reach out to Heba via emails, etc. I will give them the opportunity to say maybe one final comment, if they have one final message for you all as you are about to enter in-depth discussion in the next 2 days on particular case studies and themes. Heba, one final message for our audience?
I would just say that as you think about new models, when the obstacles come up, and they inevitably will, or the concerns around politicization, etc., instead of then saying that won't work, ask, what can I do to mitigate the negative impact of this model, just as there are negative impacts of the current model. And so to orient your thinking around, okay, a more advocacy slant will bring the following risks. How do we mitigate those risks rather than dismissing it out of hand? Might just be a way of allowing yourself to engage with that hypothesis a little bit more deeply. And good luck. I know it's not black and white. I know it's not easy, but I think it's also fair to say we know that the current system is untenable. So let's be open to an imperfect alternative.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll all bear this in mind. And any final point you wanted to?
Yeah, no, I think I said my final thoughts. But again, I just wanted to say good luck to us all. I think we're it's a very difficult testing times. Thank you.
Yes. So before you all depart, just a point of clarification. The next session will start at 11, and the session on Congo will be on the first floor in Clay Stahl room, and the one on safe abortion will be on the second floor in the Edison Saal room. Thank you all very, very much. Have a wonderful day.